Dean Mercer pulled into the Monterey auction house on a Tuesday morning, the way a man with nothing to prove pulls into anywhere, slowly, steadily, and without apology. His pickup truck was a 2004 Ford F-150, the kind of vehicle that had earned every scratch across its bumper, and trailing behind it on a flatbed trailer was the reason he had driven 4 hours south from his garage in Fresno. The thing on the trailer was covered in a canvas tarp, but the tarp did nothing to hide the shape beneath it. The long, low crouch of a coupe from another era, a silhouette that anyone who truly loved American automobiles would recognize even half buried under old cloth and road dust. Dean parked the truck, climbed out, and didn't look around at the other vehicles in the staging bay. He didn't need to. He could hear them. The Monterey Collector Classic was one of the most respected automotive auction events on the West Coast. Held every year in the third week of October, it drew serious money, serious collectors, and the kind of cars that appeared in museum catalogs. That morning, the staging bay held a 1961 Ferrari 250 GT SWB in red so deep it looked almost burgundy under the halogen lights, a 1965 Shelby Cobra 427 finished in Guardsman blue with twin white racing stripes, a 1973 Porsche 911 Carrera RS Touring in Grand Prix white, and an Aston Martin DB5 in silver birch that looked as though it had been driven off a film set. The combined estimated value of those 4 vehicles alone exceeded $4.5 million. The air in the staging bay smelled like polish, money, and a particular kind of confidence that only surfaces when people are certain they belong somewhere. Dean Mercer did not appear certain of anything except the work he had come to do. He was 41 years old, with the kind of forearms that come from years of mechanical labor and the kind of quiet in his eyes that comes from years of something else entirely. He wore a faded denim jacket over a gray thermal shirt, work boots that had seen 1,000 shop floors, and his dark hair was shorter on the sides than it used to be because his son Nolan had told him the longer cut made him look like he was trying too hard. He was not a man who tried too hard. He was, by every external measure, someone who did not belong in this room, and he had known that before he left Fresno, and he had come anyway. He had just begun unstrapping the tarp when a voice reached him from the direction of the check-in table. "Hey!" The man walking toward him was Tyler Knox, the event's lead appraiser, and, in certain circles, a figure of considerable reputation. Tyler was 47, silver-templed, and wore a charcoal blazer over an open-collar dress shirt in a way that communicated casual authority without effort. He was good at communicating things without effort. He looked at Dean, looked at the truck, looked at the trailer, and somewhere between the second and third glance, a small smile crossed his face that was not entirely kind. "You sure this is the consignment bay? Drop-offs for parts donations are around the side." 1 or 2 technicians nearby glanced up from their work. A collector named Brooke Ellis, who had been standing near the Shelby Cobra examining its interior through the driver's window, turned at the sound of Tyler's voice and took in the scene with the particular detachment of someone who has learned to measure a room before committing to a reaction. She saw Dean's truck and trailer, processed the denim jacket and the work boots, and returned her attention to the Shelby without comment. It was a small dismissal, but it was a dismissal. Dean finished unstrapping the front corner of the tarp and pulled it back from the car's nose. What emerged was a 1963 Chevrolet Corvette split-window coupe in a shade of silver that had once been Sebring silver but had softened with time into something quieter. Not ruined, not what faded to nothing, but aged the way that certain photographs age, where the passage of time becomes part of the image rather than a subtraction from it. The chrome along the body trim carried a few fine scratches. The split rear window, the design detail that made this particular model year one of the most distinctive automobiles ever produced in America, was intact and original. The interior, visible through the glass, was tan leather, cracked along the driver's seat bolster in the way that leather cracks when it has been used honestly over many years. A small padlock secured the trunk release. Dean held the key to that lock in the front pocket of his jeans, and he had not let it out of his possession since the car had been entrusted to him. Tyler looked at the car the way a surgeon looks at a patient who has arrived for the wrong procedure. "Split window," he said. "Points for the model year at least. But I'm going to be honest with you, brother. The provenance is going to have to be immaculate for this to get serious attention. The paint alone is going to scare off the Tier 1 bidders." He paused. "There's a low-tier classic section on the east side of the floor. Might be more comfortable for something like this." "I'm not here to sell," Dean said. He said it evenly, without heat. "I'm here for a professional appraisal for insurance documentation and to have the historical records verified by a third party." Tyler's smile held, but something behind it adjusted. "All right," he said, "we can do that. Naomi will get you registered." Nolan Mercer, who was 14 years old and had ridden down from Fresno in the passenger seat of the pickup because it was a school holiday, and because he had never been to Monterey, and because his father had said yes when he asked, had been standing quietly near the rear of the trailer during the exchange. He had his father's stillness and his mother's eyes, and he had been watching Tyler Knox with the focused attention of a kid who has learned, earlier than most, that adults are not always what they present themselves as being. When Tyler walked away, Nolan moved up beside his father and looked at the Corvette. "He thinks it's junk," Nolan said. Dean crouched and ran a thumb along the lower edge of the front fender, checking the gap between panel and bumper the way he always did when he first approached a car he cared about. "People laugh at what they don't understand faster than they stop to ask where it came from," he said. He stood and put a hand briefly on the back of Nolan's neck. "Remember that." Naomi Pierce was the event's documentation coordinator, a 38-year-old woman with the thoroughness of an archivist and the instincts of someone who had spent 15 years in the auction world, long enough to develop a sense for when something didn't fit the pattern in an interesting way rather than an inconvenient one. She processed Dean's registration paperwork without condescension, which he appreciated, and when she walked around the Corvette to photograph it for the official catalog, she paused at the driver's side door and leaned close to the lower edge of the dashboard, visible through the window glass, where a small mark was inscribed in the metal. It was not a factory mark. It was hand-done, precise, a stylized double V inside a circle, roughly the size of a thumbnail, the kind of signature a craftsman might leave on work he was proud of. She had seen a version of that mark once before, in a technical archive photograph from a Corvette engineering document dated 1962. She photographed it carefully and said nothing yet, because in her experience, the moments that mattered most were the ones you let develop at their own speed. The morning session began at 10 o'clock with the Ferrari and proceeded with the efficient elegance that Tyler Knox prided himself on managing. The staging floor had filled with the usual population of a major collector event, men and women who had built enough wealth to pursue the specific happiness of owning machines that most people would never touch, a few younger inheritors still learning which questions to ask, several journalists and photographers, and a cluster of serious buyers who stood near the back with the contained energy of people who had already decided what they wanted and were waiting for permission to get it. Tyler's appraisal team, 3 men whose collective experience covered 6 decades of collector vehicles, spent approximately 11 minutes with Dean's Corvette. They walked around it twice, photographed the exterior, noted the paint condition and chrome wear on their tablets, and attempted to open the trunk before Dean quietly informed them that the trunk would remain locked until the formal evaluation. The lead appraiser, a compact, silver-haired man named Gerald, who had been doing this since 1987, wrote down his preliminary findings without looking up and handed the sheet to a junior associate. "Barn find presentation," he said, which in the auction world is a phrase that means a car has been stored or neglected for a significant period and carries the implication of diminished value regardless of what might lie underneath. "It's not a barn find," Dean said. "The surface condition suggests extended storage," Gerald replied, not unkindly but with the finality of someone whose professional vocabulary does not have room for argument. "The surface condition suggests it was preserved, not neglected," Dean said. "There's a difference." Gerald looked at him for a moment, then looked at the car, and then wrote something else on his sheet that Dean could not read from where he stood. From across the floor, a collector named Marcus Wren, one of the Tier 1 bidders, a man who had paid $750,000 for a 1967 Ferrari 330 P4 replica 18 months prior, glanced over at the Corvette and said to the man beside him, with no particular cruelty but with the casual certainty of someone who believes his assessments are facts, "Split windows, a great year. But that thing looks like it came straight out of somebody's field. Needs a full restoration before it belongs in this room." The man beside him, who was named Patrick, and who collected primarily pre-war European automobiles, nodded without looking. Tyler circulated through the floor before the formal session opened, speaking to bidders, confirming seat assignments, and managing the specific atmosphere he always tried to maintain. One of informed enthusiasm calibrated to produce competition without anxiety. When he paused near Dean's car a second time, a thought had already formed behind his measured expression that he had not shared aloud. He had heard a rumor, years ago, at a private dinner in San Francisco, hosted by a collector whose name he preferred not to say in mixed company, about a 1963 Corvette with non-standard engineering that had been built or modified under the direction of a man named Richard Vaughn before the Vaughn Heritage Motors empire had become what it eventually became. He had heard the rumor was real. He had also heard the car had been lost or disposed of during a difficult period in Vaughn's business history. He had spent intermittent time over several years trying to trace it through records and intermediaries without success. And now here was a silver 1963 Corvette split-window coupe, brought in by a man who looked like a shop mechanic, with a locked trunk and a request for historical verification, and something in Tyler Knox's chest that he would not have described as conscience, but that served a similar function told him to move carefully. He moved, instead, toward the VIP registration desk to confirm the afternoon's arrivals. Claire Vaughn's name was on the list. He had known it would be, because Claire Vaughn attended the Monterey Collector Classic every year, the way certain people attend the same events every year, not only because they enjoy them, but because they are part of an identity that has been constructed over time and requires maintenance. She was 39, the chief executive officer of Vaughn Heritage Motors, a company her father had built into one of the most respected names in classic American automotive restoration and preservation. She had taken over the company at 31, when Richard Vaughn's health had begun its long, private decline, and she had run it with the kind of disciplined clarity that earned respect even from people who would have preferred, for various reasons of tradition and discomfort, that she not be in the room. She was not someone Tyler Knox was comfortable with, because she had a way of asking questions that made it clear she had already considered the answer, and was interested primarily in whether you would provide it honestly. She arrived at 11:15 in a dark car, with a driver dressed in a charcoal suit over a black turtleneck, carrying the specific stillness of a person who has learned to conserve energy for the moments that require it. She accepted a catalog at the registration desk, exchanged brief greetings with 2 or 3 people she knew, and began a circuit of the floor. When she reached the section where Dean's Corvette stood, positioned somewhat apart from the main display line, in the way that things which don't fit the primary category tend to get positioned. She stopped. She stopped the way a person stops when something they were not expecting to feel rises through them before they have time to prepare for it. She looked at the car. The silver that was no longer quite silver. The particular proportion of the rear haunches, the split rear window, the stance that even under the fluorescent and halogen lighting of the auction floor had something in it that photographs from her childhood had fixed permanently in some portion of her memory she could not have accurately mapped. She looked at it for 4 seconds without moving. Then she reached out and held her water glass a little more tightly than she needed to. Her father had kept a photograph on the corner of his desk in his home office in Marin. The photograph was black and white and showed a young man. Her father, before she was born, before the company, before most things, standing beside a Corvette coupe. He had never explained the photograph when she asked about it as a child, except to say that it was a car he had known once, a car he had let go of before he should have. He called it, in the slightly theatrical way he sometimes had, when he was being honest about something that cost him, the one that got away. She had always assumed it was metaphor as much as fact, the way adults sometimes dress plain regret in the language of objects. She had never looked for the car, because she had never had specific reason to believe it still existed in a form that could be found. She was looking at it now. She did not yet move toward it, because Claire Vaughn had learned long ago that certainty and feeling were not the same thing, and she was not certain. But when Tyler Knox appeared beside her and began to explain, with the confident authority of a man performing his function, that the silver Corvette was a promising model year but presented with insufficient provenance and would likely be placed in a lower appraisal tier, she felt something that she would later describe only as patience exhausted. Tyler had just returned to the podium and opened his notes for the preliminary appraisal announcements when Claire Vaughn raised her hand. She was not seated in the general audience. She was in the VIP section, 3 rows back from the front, and when she raised her hand it was with the calm deliberateness of someone who has decided something and is finished deciding. Tyler saw her hand and assumed she had a procedural question. He gave her the floor. $1 million, she said. The room did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet in a wave, the way rooms do when something has been said that requires a moment to travel from ear to comprehension. The people nearest to Claire registered at first, then the people behind them, then the far edges of the floor, until by the time perhaps 3 seconds had passed, the entire space had settled into a silence that had texture and weight to it. Tyler Knox looked at her. His expression was professionally composed, but underneath the composition something had shifted. "Mrs. Vaughn," he said, "could you repeat that?" $1 million, Claire said again, at the same volume, with the same absence of performance, for the 1963 Corvette, before you assign a tier. At the rear of the floor, near where the Corvette stood on its display platform, Dean Mercer had turned from a conversation with Naomi Pierce and was looking at the VIP section with an expression that contained something that was not quite fear and not quite surprise but shared territory with both. His son Nolan was watching Claire Vaughn with the complete attention of a 14-year-old who has just watched the atmosphere of a room change without entirely understanding why. From the collector's area, Marcus Wren said, with genuine confusion rather than skepticism, "She just bid $1 million on a car she hasn't had opened." The collector beside him was quiet. Claire stood. She moved to the front of the VIP section without hurrying. "I'm not bidding on condition," she said, addressing the room with the clarity of someone who has run executive meetings and has no interest in being misunderstood. "I'm bidding on provenance. I believe I know what this car is." and I am placing this bid to ensure that no one in this room takes any further action with it before I have the opportunity to confirm what I believe." Tyler collected himself. He was, above everything else, a professional, and professionalism is what he reached for. "Mrs. Vaughn," he said, with the careful warmth of a man diffusing something, "it's entirely possible this car has sentimental associations for you, but—" "I pay for things I recognize," Claire said. "You look at the surface, I'm looking at something else." A few people in the room glanced at each other. Naomi Pierce, in the back, had taken out her phone and was photographing the scene with the quiet efficiency of someone who understands she is present at a moment that will be discussed later. Dean stepped forward from beside the Corvette. The attention of the room shifted to him, this man in the denim jacket who had been half invisible for the last 2 hours, and he spoke in a voice that did not require projection to reach every corner of the floor. "The car isn't for sale," he said. "It was never here to be sold." The room absorbed this in silence. "Then why is it here?" Tyler asked. "Because the story needs a witness," Dean said. It was not the kind of thing people said in auction houses, and the room registered this in the way rooms register things that don't belong to the expected vocabulary. Tyler started to respond. Claire had already moved. She walked across the floor toward the Corvette, and the crowd parted for her with the instinctive deference that people extend to someone who is moving with absolute purpose. She stopped at the driver's side quarter panel and rested her fingertips on the surface of the car, lightly. The way you touch something you're not sure is real. She looked at the rear window, the split, the original glass in its original frame. She looked at the proportions of the rear deck. She said, barely above a whisper, directed at no one in particular, or perhaps at the car itself, "Dad, is this the one?" The room was close enough to still that Dean Mercer heard her. He looked at her. He said, "Your father was Richard Vaughn?" Claire turned. "Yes," she said. Dean did not move for a moment. Then he reached into the front pocket of his jeans and closed his hand around the key to the trunk. They moved to a side room, Claire, Dean, Naomi, and an older man named Warren Hale, who had materialized from the back of the floor with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been waiting for the story to reach him. Warren was 64, a former chief engineer at a major automotive manufacturing firm and the foremost private authority on mid-century American performance vehicles in the western United States. He had white hair and the kind of hands that had spent as much time drawing technical diagrams as shaking hands at events like this one. He had not spoken yet. He did not need to. Claire told the room what she knew about her father, which was more and less than she had realized until she began saying it aloud. Richard Vaughn had been, before he was the founder and public face of Vaughn Heritage Motors, a young engineer with a passion for American performance vehicles so specific and so deep that it had shaped the first 20 years of his professional life before it shaped his business decisions. He had worked, briefly, as a consultant in the early 1960s with a small team of Chevrolet engineers who were exploring chassis and drivetrain modifications for the Corvette platform outside of the official production program. It was the kind of work that happened in that era at the margins of corporate engineering. Not officially sanctioned, not officially denied, carried out by men who loved the machines enough to stay late and spend their own money on the question. Richard had been 24 years old. The car they had worked on, the car they had built, essentially, as a private prototype, was a 1963 Corvette split-window coupe, whose engine had been modified with specifications that did not appear in any factory documentation and whose chassis had been subtly altered in ways that Warren Hale, looking at the car now, would need to verify but that he had reason to believe were real. "He called it his car," Claire said. "He never said which car specifically. I always thought it was figurative." She paused. "He kept a photograph of it on his desk until the week he died. I never saw the car in his possession, I assumed he'd sold it at some point, or it had been lost. Dean set the key on the table in front of him. He did not pick it up yet. He brought the car to my garage 9 years ago, Dean said. October 2015. I was in a bad position at that point. My wife Paige had passed the year before, and I was carrying the medical debt from her last 8 months of treatment, and I was 3 months from losing Mercer Classic Works because I didn't have the operating capital to keep the doors open. Richard Vaughn walked in with that car on a trailer behind a rental truck and offered me a long-term restoration contract with a significant advance payment. He looked at the key. He said the car needed careful work, not fast work. He said I should take my time and document everything. He said not to open the trunk for anyone except the right person. How would you know the right person? Claire asked. He said I'd know because they'd already know what they were looking at before I told them. Claire sat with that for a moment. He also said, Dean continued, that there were people who knew about the car and wanted to get their hands on it, and that if I was ever approached about selling it before the right person came, I should decline and keep records of who was asking. He picked up the key. Are you ready to see what's in the trunk? Yes, said Claire. Warren Hale said, I'd like to be present for that. Dean looked at him. You know who Richard Vaughn was. I worked with him, Warren said. Not on this car, but I knew the project existed. I never knew what happened to the vehicle. The Corvette was brought into a private service bay adjacent to the main floor. Naomi set up 2 portable lights. Dean used his key on the small padlock that secured the trunk, a custom edition, not factory, installed with the care of someone who has thought about what they are protecting, and lifted the trunk lid. Inside, beneath a layer of protective foam and acid-free tissue paper of the kind used to store archival materials, was a flat metal box, approximately the size of a large hardcover book and perhaps 4 inches deep, coated in a rubberized, weather-resistant material. Beside it was a manila envelope, sealed and addressed in handwriting that Claire recognized immediately because she had grown up reading it. And below both of those items, wrapped separately, was what appeared to be a bound journal, navy blue with a leather cover, its spine showing the kind of careful wear that comes from regular consultation over many years. Dean lifted the metal box out first and set it on a cloth he had spread on the floor of the service bay. He unlatched it. Inside the box, arranged with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about preservation, a set of technical drawings on drafting paper. The older kind, cream-toned, with the precise pen lines of engineering illustration from the early 1960s. A contact sheet of photographs showing a young man in a workshop with the Corvette at various stages. A separate page of handwritten specifications with column headings that Warren Hale leaned forward to read, and then went very still, and a document on formal letterhead that Dean had never opened but which Richard had told him was the paper trail confirming the car's engineering history. Warren looked at the technical drawings for a long time without speaking. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful and quiet, the voice of someone measuring each word against what it is about to mean. These are real, he said. I recognize the notational system. Richard used this system. I've seen it in documents from his consulting period. He looked up. The engine modifications documented here, if they are present in this car, represent a configuration that was never replicated in production and was never publicly disclosed. It was discussed internally as a proof of concept for a performance variant that was ultimately shelved for reasons that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with corporate politics. He set the drawings down. If this car is what these documents say it is not just a collector vehicle. It is a piece of automotive engineering history that the official record does not contain. Tyler Knox had followed the group to the service bay. He had stood at the doorway through most of the exchange, and when Warren finished speaking, he said, with the particular composure of a man running out of positions to retreat to. That documents of this kind could be fabricated, that provenance required more than a stack of old papers, that the market would need independent verification before any meaningful valuation could be. Dean reached into the metal box and withdrew a photograph. He set it on the cloth beside the other materials. It showed Richard Vaughn, older than the young man in the workshop photographs, with gray at his temples and a different weight to his expression, standing in a garage that anyone who had visited Mercer Classic Works would recognize by the layout of the tool wall behind him and the particular angle of the north-facing window. Beside him was the Corvette. Beneath the photograph, in Richard's handwriting, Mercer Classic Works, Fresno, California. October 14, 2015. Tyler looked at the photograph. He said nothing. Naomi had been looking at something on her tablet. She set the tablet on the work table and pointed to the screen without comment. On it was a document, a series of internal emails she had retrieved from a collector industry archive that had been made public as part of a fraud investigation 2 years prior. The emails were between Tyler Knox and a private collector fund based in Nevada. The subject line of the first email, dated 7 months prior to the current date, read, "Vaughn Corvette, confirmed location TBD." The email body referred to a vehicle with incomplete provenance documentation and a seller who was likely motivated by financial pressure. A subsequent email, dated 4 months ago, used the phrase "low provenance, pressure seller" in a context that made its meaning clear. A third email outlined a plan for reintroduction to market as recovered Vaughn Heritage prototype at a projected resale value of between $2 and $3 million. The room was very quiet. Claire did not look at Tyler when she spoke. She was looking at the photograph of her father. "You knew about this car," she said. "I knew rumors," Tyler began. "You tracked it," Claire said. "You identified the owner. You came here today knowing what you might be looking at, and you spent the morning trying to undervalue it so that he would take a low offer and you could buy it through a third party and sell it for 3 times the price." Tyler's professional composure, which had been under considerable pressure for the last 20 minutes, held its structure in the way that a facade holds its structure after the internal frame has been compromised. Intact for the moment, but only for the moment. "The auction industry," he started. "The auction industry," Warren said, from the other side of the work table, with the gravity of a man who has spent a lifetime in it, has rules about conflict of interest. "You were simultaneously acting as appraiser and as an interested buyer through a third party. That is not the industry. That is fraud." He picked up his jacket from the chair where he had placed it. "I'll be speaking to the event board before the afternoon session." Dean had been standing at the far end of the work table, one hand resting on the side of the Corvette as though keeping contact with something that required steadying. He looked at Tyler now, not with anger, which would have been understandable, but with something more considered than anger, the expression of a man who has chosen his response carefully. "I could have sold this car," he said. "In the first year I had it, I could have sold it and paid off everything Paige's illness cost us and had money left over. There were 3 people who came through my garage in those 12 months who wanted to buy it, and I didn't know what it was worth, and I could have said yes." He paused. "I didn't sell it because Richard Vaughn paid me what he owed me when I didn't have anything left. And when a man like that asks you to keep faith with something, you keep faith with it. You're standing here telling me the thing I kept faith with was just an opportunity you were waiting to exploit." His voice remained even throughout. "That's not the market. That's something else." Tyler looked at Dean for a moment, then at Claire, then at the photograph on the cloth. Then he left the service bay. Claire watched him go and then looked at Dean. "He would have gotten away with it," she said, "if I hadn't been here today." "You were always going to be here," Dean said. "Your father picked this auction. He picked this year. He left me instructions to bring it here." He allowed a small pause. "He knew you came every year." Claire looked at the sealed manila envelope with her name on it, in her father's handwriting. She had not opened it yet. She opened it now. The letter inside was 4 pages, handwritten, on paper that had yellowed slightly at the margins. Richard Vaughn's handwriting was the same throughout, deliberate, architectural, the handwriting of an engineer who believed in the structure of things. Claire stood in the service bay under the portable lights with her father's letter in her hands and read it in silence while Dean and Warren and Naomi waited without speaking. When she reached the 3rd page, she stopped at a passage and read it twice, and then a 3rd time, and when she looked up, her face held the particular stillness of someone who has just understood something they had needed to understand for a long time. She read aloud, without preamble, "If you ever find this car, don't ask what it is worth. Ask who tried to make it disappear." The afternoon session of the Monterey Collector Classic did not proceed as scheduled. Claire Vaughn spoke with the event director for approximately 20 minutes, and then the event director spoke to the board, and then an announcement was made that the program would be adjusted to include an unscheduled presentation in the main hall at 2 o'clock. The announcement described it as a significant provenance disclosure of historical interest to the collector community and requested the attendance of all guests currently on the floor. Most of them stayed. The Corvette was moved to the center of the main hall on its display platform. The technical drawings and photographs from the trunk were arranged on a large table beside it. Warren Hale stood at the front of the room with a wireless microphone and the specific authority of a man who has spent a career being right about things and has learned that the most useful version of authority is the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Dean stood to his left, near the car. Claire stood to his right. Warren presented the history methodically and without theater, because the facts were sufficient. He explained the 1962 consulting project, the engineering team, the nature of the modifications documented in Richard Vaughn's drawings. He described the engine configuration in technical terms that approximately a third of the room understood in full and the rest understood well enough. He confirmed, based on his visual inspection of the engine through the hood that Dean had now opened at Claire's request, that the primary modifications documented in the drawings were present in the actual vehicle, not replicated later, but original, built during the period the documents described. He noted that a second set of technical records, held in a private archive in San Jose, could be cross-referenced to confirm the car's specifications, and that he would be initiating that process within the week. The collector audience, which had begun the presentation in the skeptical silence of people who have seen many claims made and many provenance stories told, shifted gradually into a different kind of quiet. The quiet of people reassessing. Marcus Wren, who had said the car looked like it had come out of somebody's field, sat in the second row with his hands clasped in his lap and said nothing. Brooke Ellis had her catalog open to the page where the Corvette's preliminary listing appeared, and she had drawn a line through the low-tier notation with her pen. Dean spoke briefly and plainly. He described the day Richard Vaughn had come to Mercer Classic Works, the condition of his own business at that point, the contract and the advance that had kept the garage operating, the instructions he had been given, and the 9 years during which he had followed them. He described the 3 times the car had been approached by buyers he did not know, 2 of whom he later suspected had connections to the collector fund whose name appeared in the emails Naomi had found. He said none of this with self-pity or performance. He said it the way a man gives an account of something that happened, accurately, and without additional architecture. When he finished speaking, he looked at Naomi, who nodded. She had already sent the documentation, the emails, the records, the conflict of interest materials, to the event's legal liaison, and to two journalists who covered the collector market. Tyler Knox had been escorted from the building by a member of the event's board within an hour of the service bay confrontation. An investigation into his appraisal practices and his relationship with the Nevada Collector Fund was, as of that afternoon, formally underway. Dean turned to the Corvette. He looked at it for a moment the way you look at something you have been responsible for and are about to release into a different kind of care. Then he opened the driver's door and sat in the seat and put the original key, not the trunk key but the ignition key, kept on the same ring, into the switch and turned it. The engine turned over once, twice, and then it caught. The sound that came from the Corvette was not the polished, tuned, exhibition-ready sound of a concours vehicle. It was rougher than that, and richer than that, and more alive than that. The sound of an engine that had been maintained with care rather than restored for performance. An engine that had been preserved rather than perfected, and that carried in its idle the specific character of something built by hand, by people who knew what they were doing and cared whether it was right. The exhaust note filled the hall and then settled into a low, warm, persistent thrum that vibrated faintly in the floor and the walls and in the chest of everyone who was standing close enough to feel it. The hall was completely silent, except for the engine. Claire stood beside the car with one hand resting on the roof. Her expression was the expression of someone who has found something they had given up looking for, and who is not certain yet how to carry it, but who is not going to put it down. A collector who had been among the first to dismiss the car when it arrived. A man in his 50s named Gerald Forrest, who collected pre-war American vehicles and had a reputation for precision, made his way to where Dean was sitting in the driver's seat. He waited until Dean shut the engine off and climbed out. Then he said, without preamble, "You really won't sell it? Even now?" Dean pocketed the ignition key. "There are things I fix to sell," he said. "There are things I keep because the people who aren't here anymore can't protect their own story, and somebody has to." Gerald Forrest looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, once, and went back to his seat. 3 weeks after the Monterey auction, Claire Vaughn announced the establishment of the Richard Vaughn Classic Legacy Fund, capitalized at $1 million, the same figure she had placed as her bid on the floor of the auction house. The fund had 3 stated purposes: the full professional restoration of the 1963 Corvette to its original engineered specifications, under the technical direction of Dean Mercer, the creation of a grant program to support small independent garages engaged in the preservation of mid-century American automobiles, and a scholarship for automotive technicians under the age of 25 pursuing careers in classic vehicle restoration and preservation. The Corvette remained at Mercer Classic Works in Fresno. Dean had accepted the role of principal restoration advisor to the fund, which came with a consulting retainer that was enough to stabilize the garage's finances for the next several years, and with a formal agreement that gave him final authority over every technical decision relating to the vehicle. The car would not be restored to a showroom standard that erased its history. It would be restored to running condition, its mechanical systems brought back to full function, its original specifications honored in full, and its exterior, the silver that had softened with time to something quieter and truer, would be preserved as it was. Naomi Pierce published her account of the auction in a collector industry magazine under the headline, "The $1 Million Bid That Wasn't About Buying a Car." The piece ran to 3,000 words and was reprinted in 2 other publications. Tyler Knox's investigation concluded 4 months later with a finding of undisclosed conflict of interest in 6 separate appraisals over a 3-year period. He was barred from participating in appraiser-certified events for 7 years. Warren Hale completed his cross-referencing process with the San Jose Archive, and the findings confirmed the car's engineering history in full. A formal documentation package was submitted to two automotive historical societies. The 1963 Corvette was added to the historical record, not as a prototype that had been lost, but as one that had been kept safe. It was on a Saturday in January, 4 months after Monterey, that Nolan Mercer sat down across from his father at the kitchen table in the house on Maple Street in Fresno, and asked him the question he had been working up to since the afternoon in the service bay when he had watched his father stand at the work table and speak to Tyler Knox in a voice that had never risen above conversational. He had been thinking about the question for 4 months, turning it over in the way that 14-year-olds turn over questions that seem to contain something larger than they can yet fully see. "Dad," Nolan said, "do you ever feel like you should have just taken the money?" Dean was finishing his coffee. He set the mug down and looked at his son with the full attention he had always given him, the attention that said the question had been heard and was being treated as the real question it was. "Money changes accounts," Dean said. "Promises change people." He picked his mug back up. "There's a difference between what you can have and what you decide to be. Sometimes they're the same thing. Sometimes they're not." Nolan thought about that. He would continue thinking about it for some time. On a Wednesday afternoon in late February, Claire Vaughn drove herself, not the car with the driver but her own car, a plain dark sedan, to Fresno. She brought with her a photograph, framed now, of Richard Vaughn standing beside the Corvette in his home office in Mara Inn, the same photograph from the desk she had looked at throughout her childhood. She had found it among his effects after the funeral. She had kept it in a drawer for 3 years, because she had not known what to do with it, and because looking at it cost something she had not always been willing to pay. Now she knew where it belonged. Dean opened the garage at Mercer Classic Works when he heard her car pull in. The Corvette was in the center bay, its hood up, the engine visible in the particular way that an engine under careful restoration is visible, not torn apart, but opened the way you open something you are tending to. The afternoon light came through the north-facing window at an angle that caught the silver of the body and made it something other than simple. Claire stood in the doorway for a moment before she came inside. She held out the photograph. Dean took it, looked at it for a moment, and then set it on the tool shelf above the workbench where it could see the car. $1 million still on the table," Claire said, "if you ever change your mind." Dean looked at the Corvette. He reached for the rag he kept draped over the fender edge and turned it once in his hands. "You know I won't," he said. "I know," Claire said. "That's why my father chose you." The garage was quiet. The Corvette stood under the afternoon light, and the photograph of the young man who had built it watched from the shelf. Dean Mercer and Claire Vaughn stood in the same space together, a single father who fixed cars for a living and a CEO who ran a company that carried her father's name. And between them was a car that had been preserved not because of what it was worth, but because of what it meant. And the difference between those two things was the whole story.